All right, so in this lesson, this is lesson 4.4, ion notation. Please make sure that before you continue watching this video that you have titled your notes lesson 4.4, ion notation. There are two things you need to learn from watching this video. One, know how we represent ions in a written form. So the written form, how do we write out ions without drawing them? We call that ion notation. And secondly, be able to identify the number of protons, neutrons, and electrons in an ion when it is written in ion notation. So before we start talking about how do we write ions and what does each part of this mean, let's review something that we should know from last semester, right? What does the top number, bottom number mean? And how do we know that? Right? So oftentimes when we look at an element or an atom, it looks like this picture, a regular elements, right? But it's kind of annoying to have to draw this every single time. So oftentimes we'll write it in written notation or shorthand isotope notation like it shows here. So let's remind ourselves what each part means. So starting with my bottom number, this number 4 is the number of protons I have, right? So the elements Be has 4 protons, right? And if I didn't know that this was Be, and I know that it has 4 protons, I can look at ptable.com and find elements number 4, and that will let me know that it is Be. So the number of protons will always let me know what type of element it is. The other number that this bottom number 4 tells me is it also tells me the number of electrons in a neutral atom. So when I say neutral atom, I just mean when it is in its regular form. So regular elements of beryllium will have 4 electrons. Okay, so now let's talk about the upper number on the upper left-hand side. So on the upper left-hand side, do you remember what that is? Hopefully you do. If not, it's okay. I'll let you know right now. So the number 9 up here represents the mass or the weight of the atom, right? And the mass is made up of 2 parts. One part of the mass is always the number of protons. So in this case, it's going to be 4. The other part of the mass is made up of neutrons. So you can think to yourself, 4 plus what equals 9, and that will give you the number of neutrons. Or you can also think 9 minus 4 will equal what? And that will give you the number of neutrons. So 9 minus 4 is going to be 5. So I have 5 neutrons. And in this case, since I show you the picture of the same elements, we also know that it has 5 neutrons when we draw it in the image form, the model form. Right? So that's a recap of what each parts of the isotope notation or shorthand isotope notation means. But now we have something new because we're talking about ions. This number with a plus or minus sign at the end. Right? So this part, if I see a positive 2, the plus means the ion has lost electrons, right? So if I have my regular elements that normally has 4 electrons, right? So here it has 1 electron, 2, 3, and 4. And then when it becomes an ion, it loses this one up here and it loses the one on the right. So these two kind of like just disappear. Right? So the +2 means it's going to lose 2 electrons. So you might be kind of confused. Wait, if I lose 2 electrons, why would it be +2? Well, that has to do with the charge of the protons and the charge of the electrons. So when I say charge, I'm talking about magnetic plus or minus. So let me show you why it's +2. Right? So for protons, if I have 4 protons from this number here, 1, 2, 3, 4. So remember, protons are a positive charge. 1, 2, 3, 4, and I have 4 of them, right? And if I start out with 4 electrons and I lose 2, then I only have 2 left, right? These 2 electrons here. So if I have 4 electrons total and I'm going to lose 2, 4 minus 2, or 4 losing 2, would just be 2 electrons. And if I look at the overall charge, or the magneticness of this particular ion, I end up with 2 positive charges. So that's why it's 2 plus, right? So when you're losing 2 electrons, you end up with a charge or a magneticness of 2 positive. Okay? So what if it was the opposite, right? So here I have O with a 2 minus. Can you guess how many electrons total I would have for this one? Go ahead and pause the video and unpause when you're ready. Okay, so you might notice on the slide that minus means the ion has gained electrons, right? And if I look at the image here, from the regular elements, just at the electrons, 1, 2, it's got 8 electrons total, shown by this bottom number here. So let's just look at the electrons for now. So this means I have 8 electrons. And up here, where it says -2, notice that minus means the ion has gained electrons. So it's going to gain 2 electrons. So how many electrons do I have total? Well, if I have 2 extra of them before, it's going to have 10 electrons total, right? So notice that here, I'm going to have 10 electrons total when it is an ion. So if I were to double check from a regular elements, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8 electrons down here. I'm going to write E minus, short for electrons. And just like we said before, our bottom number tells us how many electrons we have, right? So if we're looking at an ion now, this is the ion, or way we write ion. Minus means I get 2 extra electrons. So 8 plus 2 should be 10. And if I double check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So here I have 10 electrons total. So that checks out. In my notes, I would definitely write a symbol and ion notation and what the plus and minus means. I would also write out this section. And let me just circle in green what I mean. I would also definitely write out this section of my notes, right? Just to remind yourself what the symbols mean, and just so you can see an example of what the plus or minus means, right? Okay, so let's do some practice problems next. So something I might ask you is I might give you the shorthand isotope notation or the written formats of an isotope or an ion like this one. And I might ask you how many protons, neutrons, and electrons do I have in this element? So let's figure out how many protons I have first. So remember the protons is this bottom number. So that's going to be 15, right? And remember that my top number is my mass. So 31 is my mass. It is made up of two numbers, the number of protons I have, plus the number of neutrons that I have. So if we know how many protons we have from this bottom number, we can figure out how many neutrons I have. So here I have 15 protons, as shown to me here. So to figure out how many neutrons I have, I can just do 31 minus 15, right? So to solve for this one, I would take 31, which is my mass, minus 15 protons. So 31 minus 15 is going to be 16. So therefore, I have 16 neutrons. So my neutrons is 16. So the new thing here that's a little bit tricky is how many electrons do I have? Right? So a reminder that in a regular atom, this number 15 would also equal the number of electrons I have. So 15 electrons. But this time, recall that we have an extra thing we need to note on the upper right-hand side, this charge, right? So normally I would have 15 electrons, but remember that the minus means I'm gaining electrons, right? So it's kind of like the opposite. So you would have to then do 15 electrons, right, from this number here, plus 2 more electrons, which will give you a total of 17 electrons when P, or phosphorus, is an isotope. All right, so let's see if you can figure this one out on your own before I do this together. So feel free to pause the video. And remember, there's two things you need to remember that are brand new, right? So looking at my charge on the upper right-hand side, if I see a plus sign, that means I'm losing electrons. If I see a minus sign, that means I'm gaining electrons. Okay, and when you're ready, go ahead and unpause, and I'm going to walk through how to solve. Okay, so number of protons is what this problem is asking me for, and I'm going to use this written format to figure that out. So for number of protons, remember that's our bottom number. Therefore, I have 20 protons. To figure out neutrons, right, I'm going to have to take the mass. It's always the mass equals number of protons. I'm going to write P for protons plus the number of neutrons I have. So to solve, I would kind of do something a little bit different, right? So to solve, I would take the mass minus protons, and that will give me the number of neutrons, right? So where do I find the mass? Mass is on the upper left-hand side. This is my mass. So if I take 40 minus number of protons, this number, 20, that will give me the number of neutrons. So 40 minus 20 is going to be 20. I noticed that oftentimes people struggle with neutrons, so I would definitely write this one down, right? If it's been confusing you, it's always the mass minus number of protons will get you the number of neutrons. So electrons now. So this time, normally we have 20 electrons in irregular elements, right? So normally I have 20 electrons, but this plus 2 means I'm losing electrons. So I'm going to lose 2 electrons because the plus sign means I'm going to lose electrons. How many am I going to lose? I'm going to lose 2. So I'm going to take 20 minus 2 electrons. Right, so this number comes from here. Again, notice that it's the opposite. So 20 minus 2 will give me a total of 18 electrons. Getting a little messy here. Let me box that for you. My number of electrons is going to be 18 in this case. But what if I give you a different type of problem where I give you the elements number of protons, neutrons, and electrons, and I ask you to write the shorthand notation? So how would we do the opposite type of problem? So those would be the next two. All right, so here's the opposite type of problem where I give you the number of protons, neutrons, and electrons. And your job is to show me what the shorthand isotope notation is. So if I give you something like this, there are 3 things you need to remember. 1, you need to use ptable.com. So on a second tab on your computer, if you go ahead and open up ptable.com, you just need to type in this part, and this should show up. Right. The second thing you need to remember, and the third, is that plus means you're losing electrons, and a minus charge means you're gaining electrons. Okay. So stuff in previous stuff probably should remember. So remember that the number of protons is on our bottom left-hand side. So I'm going to have 8 protons, right? And on my upper left-hand side, this is my mass. And a reminder that the mass is always made up of 2 things: the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. So from earlier, we got that our protons is 8. And we also have 7 for neutrons. So 8 plus 7 is going to be 15. So therefore my mass is going to be 15. Right? So now I got to figure out what element symbol goes here. So what element is element number 8? Well, I don't have this memorized. Actually, I do, but in case you don't have this memorized, you're going to go to ptable.com and look for element number 8. So going on to ptable.com, remember the order of the elements go larger from left to right, top to bottom. So element number 1 is hydrogen. Element number 2 is helium. 3 is lithium, so on and so forth. So right now we're looking for element number 8. All right, so element number 8 is going to be oxygen or O. So therefore, element number 8 will be O. Right? So here's the tricky part, number of electrons. So remember, that's the number of protons, this 8 and this 8 here, also tells me the number of electrons in irregular elements. So normally, elements number 8 or oxygen will also have 8 electrons, right? So normally it has 8 electrons, but now I have 10 total according to this problem. So if I have 10 electrons, we must have added 2, right? Because 8 plus 2 equals 10. So this tells me that I have gained 2 electrons. Because I have 2 extra, or I need 2 more to make 10. So if I gain 2 electrons, my charge is going to be 2 minus. Right? And I know this because normally I have 8 electrons, and now it says it has 10, so I got 2 extra. So I've gained 2 electrons. So I'm going to write 2 because I gained 2, and when I gain electrons, it's shown by the minus sign. Okay, so my final answer, just to make things a little neater, is going to be 15, 8, O, 2 minus. That would be my final answer. So at this point, you should be able to solve some of the practice problems at the end of this Nearpod, but I'm going to do one more example problem just in case you need it. But if you feel like you've got this, you don't need this, feel free to move on to the Nearpod questions on the next slide. All right, so here's another example problem. This time we got 13 protons, 14 neutrons, 10 electrons. How would we write the symbol for that? Well, remember that on the bottom left-hand side is my number of protons. So 13 is going to be my number on the bottom left-hand side. Mass is on my upper left-hand side, and that is made up of 2 numbers. My proton plus my neutrons, right? So 3 plus 4 is going to be 7. 1 plus 1 is 2. So 27 is going to be my mass of this element. So now I got to figure out what element this is, right? And remember, the number of protons will let us know what element this is. So on ptable.com, I'm going to look for element number 13. So let's go to ptable.com, looking for elements number 13. So notice this top number is 13. This is element number 13, Al, or aluminum. So therefore, the symbol for this element is going to be Al, or aluminum. So now the trickiest part and the new thing, the number of electrons. So a reminder again that this number 13 also means I have 13 electrons usually, but this time I went from 13, right, to 10 electrons. So when it became an ion, it went from 13 electrons to 10 electrons. So how did I go from 13 to 10? Well, I need to lose 3 electrons, right? So when you're looking at this, you need to think to myself, okay, if regularly it has this many, and then now it has this many, did I lose or did I gain? Right? So here I had to lose 3 electrons in order to go from 13 to 10. So it lost 3 electrons to get 10, right? So on the upper right-hand side, how do I show that I lose 3 electrons? Well, I need to write the number 3 to show that I lost 3. And I need to remember that, hey, when we're talking about ions, when I lose 3 electrons, I show that as a plus symbol. So 3 plus. All right, and that's pretty much it. So definitely be able to solve these types of practice problems. If not, please ask me in the chat. I'd be happy to go over these problems in a slightly different way if needed. All of that good stuff.